pieces related to Pathway of Hope. And when Rachel and I set this up, and that was some months ago, we put the title of Poverty and Homelessness. And as all of you know, talking about either of those is big. So I think for the most part, what I'm going to do today, and hold on to make sure that my technology is working, is I want to try to make the distinction between poverty and homelessness. Because I think that sometimes they're obviously connections, but they just kind of get pushed together. And in the first part of the presentation, and so let me just stop and say that there are really three different things I'm doing here. The first part is data heavy. I mean, I'm a professor, and I think that there are some numbers and studies that are valuable. All of this will be on the PowerPoint that Rachel will be sending you, and then they will have the citations, the reference points for those. But if we look at the issue of poverty and homelessness, about 14% of Americans were poor last year using the standards we use, slightly less than the year before, and a little bit more than 1% were homeless. So in any given year, or 10% of Americans that are poor will be homeless sometime during a year, usually for short periods of time. And in some cases, when we're talking about homelessness, we're also talking about a range of individuals. I worked with homeless families for 9 years, and I've done training and other things related to homelessness and homelessness in schools in different parts of the country. And I do believe that there's probably as much range between people who are homeless as there are in the general population. But I don't really want to focus on homelessness today. I really want to look at really that rest of the 14% that are housed, although that can be problematic at times. Because in this presentation, I'm not really focusing on the chronically homeless, really more focusing on the poor, and most of the poor are working poor or episodically working poor. And so that's really going to be what I'm going to be looking at and talking, sharing information, and then talking with you at the end. The first part of it is going to be data. The second part is I'm going to talk about different ways to think about poverty, really to see poverty. And some of that is just the hope that that's kind of a prompt, and then that will lead into discussion. And then I want to talk some about just biases and what we do when we have biases against the people we're working with that are poor, especially those who have been poor for a while and those who keep coming back and it doesn't look like there's any movement at all. And then just a little bit toward the end in terms of things to keep in mind in working with people who are poor. Okay. So when we look at poverty in the United States, so this is the way the federal government measures poverty, and they've done that for 50 years. It was a measure that was put in place in '62, and it's just been updated for inflation since then. So a family of 4 is considered, with $23,000, is considered 4. A single individual with making $11,600 a year. And so that, as you know, is the figure that's used for cutoff for some programs. I mean, school lunch programs for children, for example, uses a multiplier of that for reduced lunch and for free lunch. There's a supplemental poverty measure that researchers have been working on, especially the Institute of Research on Poverty in Madison here in Wisconsin. And what that does is it does make some changes, and probably the most important one has to do with the 3rd and the 5th of those, when it talks about threshold adjustments. Making geographical adjustments for differences in housing costs and difference in utilities. I've got a friend who teaches social work in Maine, and Bill says that if you add in heating costs and just the fact that wages in Maine are low, that Maine would rank among the top 3 poorest states, rather than somewhere around 12th or 13th or 15th where it is now. Utilities makes a difference. The cost of housing makes a difference, as we'll look at that again. And then the last bottom, the resource measure, and that may be fairly small on your screen, maybe bigger depending, but that's saying that that when you talk about how much people have, you not only talk about cash income, but the adding food stamps, adding earned income tax credit, minus work expenses, minus out-of-pocket medical expenses, and child support paid to another household. Because the fact that child support doesn't get deducted when people are, for some programs and some things, really skews how much incomes individuals have. When you look at the supplemental poverty measure, you've still got about the same number of people that are poor. And one of the differences is that a far greater number of the elderly show up as being poor. So, but if you look at poverty rates for children and the elderly, this is from the Pew Research Center, what we see, and this really shows over time, you know, that since about 1990, that the poverty rates went down until about 1970, from late 1950s to 1970s, and then have been going back up again for children, and have been continued to be reduced for the elderly. And much of that has to do with Social Security and SSI, and the fact that in general our programs for those that are older are more comprehensive than for everybody else. When you look at what it means to be poor, and that you can find, and this is very recent from New York Times, that there's some things that cost less than they used to. And so this going back for 20 years, and unfortunately cut off just a little bit, but cost of clothing has reduced, cost of cell phone service, electronics certainly, really anything that could come out of a factory in constant dollars costs less than it used to 30 years ago. But because of imports and other societal changes, especially technology and automation, the number of people who really have, quote, middle-class incomes is less than it used to be. And so what you found in 1970, that about half the population had incomes that went up to 50% of the median income, essentially 50% of the average income. And now we're down to about 40%. So more people are making less money, those who are working, and this really comes up in terms of housing. And this is from the Low Income Housing Coalition. You know, and what they do is they talk about the housing wage in the sense of how much does it cost, how much do you have to make in order to afford a standard, standard 2-bedroom apartment, something that does not have health violations. And what you find is that in general, it's somewhere around $13.65 an hour, and Wisconsin is in that middle range, where it between $13.35 and $16.78. Michigan, Minnesota, Illinois are all in that range. But essentially what that means is that you've got to have 2 people making minimum wage jobs, or somebody with a good job, you know, a $14 an hour job, in order to afford housing if there is no assistance. And as people know, you know, about 15% of those who are poor get some kind of housing assistance. That wages have not kept up with inflation. Put a slide up that shows the historical value of the minimum wage. And so if the minimum wage had kept up with inflation, what was paid in 1968, if they'd increased it with inflation, it would be close to $11 an hour now. and it obviously isn't. So the idea of working and being able to get by no longer are equal one with the other. And I think with that, there's the whole issue of intergenerational mobility. And there is a certain feeling of despair among people in that, you know, are things ever going to get better? Part of the American dream was that each generation could live better than the others. That's intergenerational mobility. And right now there is not as much in the United States as in Canada, as in Denmark, Sweden, in any of the Northern European countries. If you're born in the bottom 20% of the income level, there's a 60% chance you'll end up in the bottom 40%. Not that much movement. And if you're born in the top 20%, there's a 60% chance that if you drop, you're not going to drop very far. And that's a whole nother discussion in terms of the increased importance of parental wealth and parental well-being in terms of how well kids do. But I want to come back to that figure I'm going to come back to this information in a minute, because I think it also helps us understand a little bit about movement while one is poor. Lack of intergenerational mobility, and most people who are poor are not always poor. So 2/3 of all Americans and 90% of all African Americans will be poor for at least 1 year. This was a study that a professor at St. Louis University did, and so that study's old. He's done more recent studies that seem to justify pretty much the same thing, that a lot of people will be poor for some periods of their life, and there may be fairly short periods, and it's really the bottom 7% that will be poor most years. The top 20% are very unlikely to ever be poor, in the sense that they have enough wealth to where if you use the poverty line in terms of a family of 4, around $23,000 or $24,000 a year, they won't dip below that. But so when we think about people who are poor, one easy way to think about it is that about half the people that are poor most of the time, and the other half come from a much larger group of people who may be poor occasionally, who may be poor off and on through the course of their lifetime. And then, of course, when we talk about poverty, we're talking about the impact of the recession, and we're still 6 years, almost 6 years from the time that hit, still pulling out of that, and the way that not only affected jobs in terms of the lack of jobs, but coming out of the recession, more of the jobs that have been created are low-wage jobs. They said that half of the jobs that women have gotten since the 2010 recession, and women have gotten more jobs than men, are jobs that pay $10 an hour or less. So that's the data, and I wanted to kind of go through that fairly quickly, just to kind of present information and then the things that I want to talk about. And I've used that image of 8 ways to think about being poor. Some of you have heard this. It's the story of blind men or blind people who came across an elephant, and the person holding the tail says it's the rope, and the person who's holding the trunk says it's a big hose, and the person holding the legs says it's a big tree, et cetera, et cetera. So I think depending on what we look at and how we look at it, we can think of a number of ways to think about being poor. And the first of those is thinking about poor as a continuum, as a range of destitution, having very, very little, to having some degree of stability. Now, those of you who are involved in the Pathway of Hope program and others are familiar with the Client Self-Sufficiency Matrix tool. And if you look at that, that there is between number 1 and number 3 on that client score. You go from no income to can meet basic needs with subsidy, appropriate spending, from homelessness or threatened with eviction to stable housing that's safe but only marginally adequate. When you get to 3, in most cases the people are still poor using the kind of measures we talked about. But there can be major difference between the degree of stability that they feel, and that's important. So I wanted to use some figures that Rachel had sent me, and this is from the Pathway of Hope, Wisconsin and Upper Michigan Division from January 13 to April 14th. And when you looked at the self-sufficiency outcome matrix, on the left, what you find is people moving from a little over 2.5 to 3 on the scale. So people are moving from less stability to more stability in terms of income. And that's a good thing. It's not that people are, quote, have made it, but I think within the range of what we can think of being poor, there are real differences both in terms of things that can be measured and in terms of people's attitude on how well they're doing. So that's one way to think about being poor in the sense of that community, that continuum or that range. The second one has to do with the impact of adverse childhood experiences. And I'm going to spend a few minutes on this because this is a really important study that came out recently. It was done of 17,000 plus people who were enrolled in a healthcare plan in Southern California. So this was not a group of just poor people. All of these were people who were enrolled in this plan. And what they did was they asked them about a number of things that had happened during childhood. And those were categorized as adverse childhood experiences. So, for example, and the point with that was that the experiences while growing up deeply impact a young person and profoundly affect emotional and physical health later in life. So these are the categories: abuse, psychological, physical, and sexual. Substance abuse in the family, mental illness in the family, domestic violence, a family member in prison, and the loss of a parent. And the loss meaning either through divorce or through death. So those were the kinds of things that if people checked that, if people indicated that was one adverse childhood experience. What the study then did was that looked and said, okay, let's not look at the impact of mental illness in your family as you're growing up, as much as how do all those things kind of add up? How do those put together? So if you look at that, about a third had no adverse childhood experiences, about a quarter had one, and kind of going on down to 11% had 5 or more, but more than a third had at least 2. And when you look at later life, that there just are a number of measures. I did not pull all of those out. So on the left, you see the percent that as adult had alcoholism, and that goes up from a little over 2% with no adverse childhood experiences to 16% with 4 and more, 11+% if you had 3 or more. The issue of chronic depression, and I think the issue of depression with people who are poor is complicated, because I think one of the other things related to depression is just that being poor for long periods of time changes your body chemistry, and I think that kind of the grinding impact of poverty can lead to depression. But what this also shows that, again, the more adverse childhood experience is the more likely. And with chronic depression, what you had with more than 4, and you're getting to 2/3 of men and over a third of, 2/3 of women and over a third of men. And serious job problems. Because I think all of us have had the experience of working with someone who can get a job and just has trouble holding on to it for more than 3 months. And there's, something happens at work and he says, I'm not going to put up with this anymore, or problems with attendance, problems with behavior, etc. And really the issue is when you look at having 2 or more of those, then you've got 14+% of adults with serious job problems. So that's a second way of doing it. A third way of thinking about poverty is that issue of being poor means you're just living on the edge. I'll put back the slide related to housing and how much one needs to make to rent a 2-bedroom apartment, because that constant worry of, am I going to have enough money to make the rent at the end of the month, and not having any money in savings so that if something comes up, that there's not a cushion that can take care of that. So I think that not only describes the actual situation, but it also describes emotionally how people feel, even if they're gotten used to it enough to where they're not verbalizing it, they're not talking about it. I think we can also talk about being poor in terms of what's in your toolkit and the applicability of tools in your toolkit. Because this sort of goes back to the whole issue of childhood, not in the point of adverse childhood experiences, but in the point of what did you learn growing up, what was your experiences growing up that can help you later in life. And certainly the experience of being able to work on, to help around the house, to do things with automobiles, that's great. And probably even more useful is the child who learns his way around a computer by the age of 3. And that really is an advantage. I mean, we know that there are lots of things that kids get from a household that are positive. I mean, there's the role model of work experience, the role model of discipline. My adult students who are going back says one of the kinds of things that helps is that, they're doing their homework, and, so the children who are in school, see mom doing it, and there really is no excuse for them not to do it. So I think there is the issue of toolkit, and I think all of us can think about what we learned in childhood that can be useful. Now, I think you can learn things regardless of the family that you grow up in. About 10 years ago, Ruby Payne, her material in terms of what one learns from a poverty household, what one learns from a middle class, what one learns from upper class, was very popular. And while it names a number of things that are valuable, I think but it doesn't necessarily mean that things from one are not valuable. I mean, one of the things she put on her list was the ability to know where the good yard sales are. And I've got friends who are certainly middle class, and Sarah prides herself on buying clothes for her grandchildren from 3 families whenever they have yard sales in the small town I live in, because their kids are just slightly older than the ages of her grandkids, and she likes the styles and the preferences of the mom. I mean, that's something that goes beyond living in lower class. But I think there's another piece of that that's important, and I want to put some words. This is a slide with a bunch of words, and this comes from Ta-Nehisi Coates, who was a journalist in Washington, D.C. And he wrote this in an article. You know, one can safely call not backing down from a fight an element of a kind of street culture. It's also an element which, when one leaves the streets, is a great impediment. I know punk may shield you from neighborhood violence. It cannot shield you from algebra when your teacher tries to correct you. It cannot shield you from losing hours when your supervisor corrects your work. And Coates tells the story about being in Washington, D.C. or New York at some event. He was blogging, and something had said about somebody really infuriated that person, and he came up and got in his face and just kept yelling at him. And Coates, who grew up on the streets of Baltimore, finally just said, "Let's go outside and settle this." And he said he was pretty sure that he had more experience fighting than that person, and the guy backed down. And he told his supervisor at the newspaper about that a little later, and the supervisor was furious. He said, "You could have ruined your career. You know, you beat up somebody because he didn't, you know, over an argument what you wrote." And Coates uses the term code switching, which I think is really valuable. And it's a valuable concept, that idea of moving from one method of communication or action in one situation to another. Think about when you were in K through 12 school. You talk to your teachers differently than you talk to your friends, right? What you did in class and what you did outside of class were different. That's code switching. That's knowing how this behavior works in this situation. Coates said that he had to act a certain way around the neighborhood not to get picked on. But that's not the kind of behavior that works. And I think what we often find is adults who get into job situations, especially those who have not had a lot of work experience and have trouble adjusting their communication style, adjusting their behaviors to hit different norms, to hit different situations. I want to talk about poverty in terms of three different kinds of people that may be poor, although there's some overlap between the first and the second. I think there's poor in terms of multi-generational poverty. People who have been poor and their parents were poor and probably their grandparents were poor. And one thing that does, and I put a screenshot from a t-shirt from a program for women who are in that situation, you know, to essentially saying, here are the things we're going to do to make sure, or as much as we can, to make sure our kids get to college and graduate college. Because depending on the family you grew up in, the expectations, et cetera, what you do with school, how important school is, what kind of jobs you look for, a lot of that is shaped by earlier generations. It's not that poor parents care less for school than middle class or upper class parents. There's a number of studies that said there's no difference in people's wish for their kids to do well, but there's a huge difference in terms of knowing what children need to do in order to succeed, and that kind of expectation that when you finish high school, you're going to go to college. The real question is which college and what are you going to study? And that comes up in some families and does not come up in other families. There's the thing of chronic poverty, that this is just the way it is. People who have been poor, they've been living on the edge, they've been maybe in and out of homelessness for longer than they can remember, and life is just kind of filled with crisis. You can think about people in that sense of being stuck, but I think another way to think about it is this is just the kind of the way things are, and you hope they'll get better for a little while, but this is probably the way they are. I was talking to a social worker I know who works in Madison with a shelter for single women and with alcohol issues, and people can stay there for up to a year. You have to be sober, and she was saying that often as it gets close to the time, people have been sober, they're about to make that year, and women relapse, and to some degree it's just the tension of life going better than it's supposed to go catches up. And one of them said, I know the other shoe's going to fall sometime. It was easier for me just to do it. If you expect that things aren't going to really get any better, then why make the effort? Then why make the effort? Another way to think about poverty, and I think this goes back to the issue of the recession, is that we come in contact with some people who are the recent poor, people who are doing okay. They were doing okay and then lost jobs, and their houses were underwater, not worth nearly as much, and so lost houses, trashed their credit record. Only one of them is working. If they're lucky, there's one of them that's working that are not, and so people who never thought that they would be asking for aid are poor and needing it. And I think in that situation, and especially for that group, but I think for other groups, the role of debt and budget counseling really has to be addressed. When we look at people who are poor much of the time, one of the real problems they have is just going to payday loans, and the figures on that is that people on average end up paying more than twice as much as they borrowed. You've got 11% of Americans who use payday loans at some point in time, and it really can be in a trap that people have trouble getting out of. And the role of budget counseling is important there. What can we do to help people to, if they don't have the money, find another way to pay that off and then not be in the kind of situation where that becomes a necessity every 2 months, every 3 months. But I think if we're talking about the recent poor, it's just that issue of people not being used to having as little money as they do. I've been on the board, founding member of a faith-based nonprofit for homeless families here in Whitewater, Wisconsin, where I live. And we have 6 houses and a less than full-time case manager coordinator. And one thing that we've been able to do through donations is get the financial peace program to really, and one of the conditions of being there, people have to work a program, and going through this budgeting process is part of the program because because people are used to spending money. Most people are not used to budgeting, not used to having a budget, and it's really difficult for people to make that distinction between needs and wants, and it's also a really gray area. I mean, in those houses, we've included internet access as part of what's available, and will help families find computers, use computers if they don't, because with school-age kids, and all of these families have kids, that having internet access and some device to do it is not as much of a luxury, and it's more of a necessity. Schools communicate by email, etc. So those are some ways to think about poverty, and we can talk about that later. One of the things that Rachel suggested that I talk about is that whole issue about how you overcome your bias, and it's difficult. I got into academia coming out of working in Settlement House in Ohio. And Settlement Houses, we did lots of things, but one of the things we did was emergency assistance, and there'd be the same people that would come back again and again, and it's really hard not to, okay, here he comes again. Here she comes again. Now, I've learned some things since I worked there that have helped me in the pieces of work that I've done with clients since then. And so here are some kinds of things that I think help us reorient the way we think about the people we work with. One is going back to that adverse childhood experience. I mean, some people are carrying a lot of baggage around, and it makes it difficult. and it makes it difficult. Lots of undiagnosed mental health issues, lots of addiction, multiple addiction issues, other kinds of things, and if we're lucky enough, if we're lucky enough to have one or fewer of those adverse childhood experiences, we need to be grateful. We need to be thankful. Mother's Day just passed. Father's Day is coming up. Call and thank your parents for stability. I was lucky that way. Not a lot of money when I grew up, but tremendous stability. My dad was never unemployed, and there always was food in the house, and there never was abuse. But I think just kind of realizing that some people, as they say back home, have a harder row to hoe than others do. A second is as we listen, and the advantage of programs like Pathway of Hope, in which you're actually getting to know the person, to know more about them than you do in doing a 15-minute emergency food or that kind of transactional analysis. The advantage of working in a program with a shelter is you do that, and one of the ways in which looking at strengths or looking at positives, as I like to use, is kind of to help go back and find times in people's lives when they were more successful, when they were more independent, when life was going better. So you're not just seeing people from the perspective of this point in time, because that's the way, unless you live in a very small town, rural area, that's the first time you're going to see people when they walk in the door, and can be a perception, assumption that things have always been this way. I did a webinar in the fall related to the stages of change model, and I think that the whole idea of the stages of change is one of the most powerful things coming out of social work and human services, social services, in the last 20 years. That idea of when somebody is not making any movement, it's not that they're necessarily lazy, it's not that they're necessarily stuck, but that idea about thinking of them as being in the pre-contemplation stage, and then in the sense of not really thinking about either the need or the possibility of things being better. And so the idea of the question then becomes, what are the things we can do that help move that person toward the point where they can start to think, work, and plan toward things being better, and then to making the kinds of preparation and action that would be useful. So I think that also can be useful in terms of helping us think about people differently. I think the thing that probably helped me the most, and I used to do groups for men who batter, and it's a hard group to work with in some ways. And one thing that I just came across and really found useful was just thinking when people are making choices that just seem bad choices, just dumb, you should not be doing this, this just does not make any sense, just to ask that question, okay, internally, so how does this make sense from that person's point of view? So what's going on in terms of their thinking pattern, in terms of their life experience, to where this would make sense? If a person doesn't expect things to ever really be good, well then splurging money on kids at Easter may really make sense, even though it puts them really at risk of being homeless, because at least for that day, things were really good. Or for other things, just try to ask that question to yourself, and then some questions will kind of follow that indirectly get at that, to try to understand what's going on with the person to do that. Another one, and I think that this came, oh, I'm sorry, I did something weird on my computer, trying to get something off the top. Let me go back. And I think this is something that I've learned from talking with workers in Salvation Army, is just the role of faith and religion in the way you see that. And I'm really quoting somebody who said, I try to see the face of Jesus in every client I meet, and yes, with some it's harder than others. I know that in my case, my view of human behavior and my Christian faith line up really well, in that I really believe that as humans we just screw up a lot. It's our nature. And my faith says that that there is mercy, and I believe we ought to try to build that into the way we see people and how we proceed with them. So that's data, that's ways to look at poverty, a little bit of information on bias. I just wanted to share a few things that I think are useful as we try to help people move from where they are to things that are better. And I think that one of those, and this is Postcard from a Better Future, is that people work when they have a sense that something is desirable and possible. It's hard work. It means putting off, not spending money on things. It may put off working more hours. It may be involved of applying for jobs, and getting rejected when you're applying for jobs and over again is not easy for anybody. But people are more likely to do it if there is an idea that they can see, and they can flesh out the image of a future that would be different and better for them. And I think we can help them in some cases to do that. We can help them with a roadmap in terms of how to get there. What are those little steps, those small steps, those goals and action plans? What's the roadmap look like? And doing this and this, and if that doesn't work, doing that, to help people visualize what that road is to a better future. And I think with both of those, when that comes, then we have the possibility of hope. One of the things that came out of that report that I mentioned earlier from the Pathway of Hope program was saying that the scales on the Hope Earth Index were going up a little bit. And that's good news, because I think when people think that the chances of things getting better is increasing, then there's likely to be more motivation, more action, etc. So that's what I wanted to do with the presentation. Rachel, I think at this point, what we should do is open it up for questions and conversation.
All right. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to either type in the box, or reflections or thoughts that you'd like to kind of throw out to the group and to Dr. Winship, or if you'd like us to unmute you and share what you're thinking or what your questions are, we can do that as well. Just raise your hand or type the questions in the box. So we'll kind of hang tight for a few minutes and see what comes up. Okay, hang on. We have one hand raised. Major Bonnie, I'll go ahead and unmute you guys, okay? So be ready. All right, you're unmuted if you want to share.
What are the scientific gaps that are indicated by the arrow on the pyramid slide?
Oh, sure. Let me go back to that.
I'm going to mute you guys. All right, I remuted you guys so you could hear the response.
So in this one, what we know in many cases is from the adverse childhood experiences, you count those up and you get to the indicators, like in terms of early death, the social problems, etc. We're not as sure exactly how that works. I mean, from a research point of view, the numbers are big enough, and the degree of reliability is great enough to where it seems to work. And there have been other studies, especially around alcoholism, that have confirmed that. What I think researchers are trying to do now is to figure out exactly, well, what's playing out in the lives of 2 and 3 and 4 and 8 and 9-year-olds where this has so much impact. And we don't know that yet. And I hope that 4 and 5 years from now, we're clear on that, because the clearer we get on that, the easier it is to think about what could be done in schools, in Head Start, in other programs, at the Army and other programs, to try to mediate or counteract the negative impact. What we do know from the resilience literature, which kind of ties in with this, is that the presence of at least one reliable person whose behavior is reliable, who cares for that child utterly, makes a huge difference in terms of not having those negative indicators.
All right. If that didn't fully answer your question, let us know. But we have another one that came that says, do you sometimes hear of cases where clients are afraid of change or moving from public assistance to self-sufficiency?
Sure. And I'm trying to hold on just a second. Rachel, I'd like to move back to the screen where I can, where I'm showing my webcam, and I'm not seeing that. So
I don't think your webcam ever launched.
Yeah, because I didn't, okay.
Oh, it's on your control panel for the.
Yeah, hold on, I think I minimized my control panel, so let me get rid of it.
Yeah, we can't see it. It hides, so.
Okay.
If you find that, then you would just click Show My Webcam.
Yeah, it was on there earlier. Hold on just a second.
If you click the little orange flower on your toolbar on the bottom, that's the GoToMeeting thing. It's like a, I think it's a flower.
It comes up on the other one. Let me, okay, hold on just a second. Sure, got it. Okay. So repeat the question again, so I'm paying more attention to that, because I know I caught at least a part of it. But people moving from change and why that's hard, right?
Yep. So, and you guys can change the ratio of the screen and the webcam on your own screens if you want. So the question was, do you sometimes hear of cases where clients are afraid of change or moving from public assistance to self-sufficiency?
Yeah, and it's hard. And I think one of the difficulties with the way the whole social welfare, social services, social benefits is set up is that there are times in which if people move too fast, you lose benefits. You know, you lose benefits. I think that housing benefits can be one of those kinds of things. I think to some degree it's a matter of planning. It's a matter of looking at what are all those options. In many cases, as people are moving towards self-sufficiency, they're not going to lose benefits, or they're not going to lose that much. Someone says, I made this much more money, but my food stamps went down. And some of it is just working, saying, okay, if you keep working, then what could happen in a year, what could happen, et cetera. So it's a matter of helping people looking at options, looking at risks, looking at trade-offs, saying, you know, this is the system we have right now. One of the real things I think that helps now, and this wasn't the case when I first started working with this, is that the more people work, the more they get an earned income tax credit. You know, and so that can be once a year, but that can be huge. You know, I know somebody, you know, was a single mom, had 4 kids, got a job, and she said, you know, that she made it because there was that, because she got that $5,000 check in the spring from earned income tax credit, and so that really made a difference.
All right. Then another question came through. It says, I have never seen poverty, desperation such as that during my trips to Haiti. Does there exist in the minds of people in America that they themselves have reached a level of hopelessness that cannot be recovered from regardless of what they do?
Poverty, poverty is different in different places. I spend about 3 weeks a year in Central America, in El Salvador. I was a Peace Corps volunteer there a long time ago, and I go back and I do various other kinds of things. And so I think you've got poverty in the United States. You've got poverty in developing countries like El Salvador and much of Asia. And then you've got really the abject poverty that you find in Haiti and Africa. It's really, I mean, those are the two places in the world in which that is. It's a different kind of poverty, and that doesn't really say anything about it. But one of the things that's difficult about being poor in the United States right now is that people are poor in the midst of plenty. And when we get back to that issue of budgeting and that needing to really, for themselves, for their families, to deny, that's really hard in a society in which people are bombarded with the need and the desire to buy things. I find a real difference in being in El Salvador now and being in El Salvador 40 years ago when I was a Peace Corps volunteer, because families there now talk about the same kind of issues with the desires for their kids, because the kids want Pizza Hut and the kids want cell phones and the kids want other things that really the worldwide consumer society says they need. So you don't find that everywhere, but it really is, the idea of traveling outside the U.S., it really gives you a different perspective on poverty than you would have otherwise.
All right. The next question is, what effect do you think raising the minimum wage in Washington to $15 will have on the economy? And it's a question mark after Washington. So.
Well, I haven't seen the $15 thing. When you go to the $10.10, which is what's being proposed by the Obama administration, what it means, and I can't quite pull the numbers out, we would lose some jobs. Some places would say they couldn't do it, and about 3 times as many people. So I think, and I don't want them to essentially state numbers if I don't have those right. And about 3 times as many people who would lose jobs would find their income being raised. One of the real advantages of raising the minimum wage is that it raises the wages of everybody above them. I was talking about this with a class in school, and one of my students says, I'm a shift manager, right? I make $1.50 more than the minimum wage. I don't make $10 an hour. And the response was, if over the 3-year period they move the minimum wage up by essentially $3, it moves everybody's wage up by at least $3. So the people that are making $10 an hour now would be essentially making $13 an hour, because they need to do that in order to keep those employees going. I don't think there's any way at this point in time that the nation would move to $15 an hour. I think there is, and given how in some ways messed up politics are, I'm not sure that the $10.10 an hour is going to happen, but it could, and I think that overall it would have an impact, and it would also mean some people would have a harder time getting into the job market.
All right. Those are all the questions we've had so far. Does anybody else have any they'd like to ask or thoughts to share?
Or thoughts to share as well. It doesn't have to be questions. It can be responses, disagreements. It's not the way I see it. And while people are thinking, Rachel, do you have any questions?
No, but I did want to share, if you guys haven't seen the most recent issue of the War Cry, there is an article that's based on the book When Helping Hurts, which talks a lot about alleviating poverty, and they allude to some of the differences of how poverty is seen. I have not read the full book, I have to be honest, but I've heard about it several times and it's on my list. But in the article, they do address some of the different feelings in poverty in other countries versus the U.S. So it might be something else people might want to read and pick up the book when they have time. There's one more question. What are the trends nationwide to address housing?
The answer is not enough. You know, and actually, I'm not sure I can answer that question well. You know, because I think to answer that well means to really spend some time looking around. I used to do a lot more with housing and homelessness than I do now, and so I'm not able to do that. When I try to get the PowerPoint out, if I've got some information, I will send that on to Rachel as well.
Anyone else before we wrap up for today? All right, I think that's, oh, never mind, hang on, just before I say goodbye. I appreciate your observation of poor in the midst of poverty and can see how in poor countries they have a different outlook because they don't see the poverty. So just a thought and kind of a...
So let me just give an example. So when I'm down, El Salvador is a small country in the middle of Central America. Okay, so I'm down there generally twice a year for 10 days or so. When I go there, and I joke because if you live in Wisconsin, anytime you get close to an ocean, you need to take advantage of it. So I generally spend a day on this small hotel on the ocean, kind of going through my notes and going through things. And I've gotten to know the waiters there. It's just a nice little hotel. It's well run, and they're able to make some money. I mean, I think that they're certainly not well off, but you know, but for example, one of the waiters, Jesus, and I take children's books down for his daughter when I go down, you know, but he's building a house himself on a very small lot. The lot's probably 30 meters by 40 meters, 30 yards by 40 yards, maybe a little smaller than that. You know, the last time I talked, he still had 10 on the windows rather than glass windows, but he was putting those in. It's got a poured floor, so it's not dirt floor. But you know, they've got enough to eat. His daughter's going to school. You know, and so in a sense, he's poor, but I don't think there is that sense of deprivation. And there certainly isn't that sense of hopelessness. And so I think that's where really, that goes back to the very end. It's that sense of hope, that sense of there are some things that are going well with life. There's a possibility of things being better. And I think that that's just very important. The other thing, just in terms of well-being, and that I didn't figure out how to put that in there. You know, but the research on happiness has a whole lot more to do with the time people spend with others that they care for, where there's, you know, support, communication, etc., than it does for well-being. There is a point where there has to be enough money to where the stress level isn't bothering, which really kind of leads to depression. But after that, you know, the question about whether somebody has $22,000 a month for a family of 4 or $82,000 a month for a family of 4, there might not be any correlation between how happy they are, how happy the family members are. It's a hard thing to talk about because it's really easy for people to glorify the happy poor, but it just does remind us that there are more things than can be measured by income and housing.
All right, we have another thought and then a question. So someone just sent a thought that most other needs can be addressed, but the housing situation seems to really stress individuals and families.
Agreed, and I think that really is and I would agree wholeheartly on that, because I think especially especially from the point of view of a parent, that sense that my children are not going to be housed, and what are we going to do about that? That's terrifying for many people. We also know that when families are not housed and they're moving around, they're staying with friends, staying with this and that, the chance of sexual abuse of children just goes way up. I mean, it's a real problem. This is not talking about, moving in with grandmother, which often is just a very stable thing to do. But when there's that housing mobility, that's really problematic, and it's something as a country that we need to pay attention to, and we really haven't. Because one thing with the recession is that people lost houses, people lost jobs, and rents continued to go up.
All right, we have a couple more questions that will come in. The next one is, can we eliminate poverty in America, or can we just reduce it?
I think we can reduce it, and I'm not sure you can eliminate poverty, period. However, I'm going to qualify that. Okay, I'm going to say first, people screw up, people make bad decisions. However, there are countries in which the whole issue of the safety net is much different than the United States. In Denmark and Norway, people pay more taxes, and they feel like they get more out of their taxes than they do. Like there is an income floor for everybody, and there is free college tuition for all kids, and so there's that sense. The difficulty about moving that way in the United States just has to do with societal values, and that idea that people should make it on their own. And so it's hard, and I think especially at this point in time there is that of the big movement in the Tea Party wing of the Republican Party to cut much of what government does on the idea that somehow things would magically get better for everybody. And I really do think it's magically, because we live in an international economy, and if you cut taxes for people that are well off, that they are just as likely to invest the money in South Africa or Denmark as they are to invest it in the United States. So it's fewer opportunities and not necessarily the multiplier for income. So I don't think there is that opportunity. I think there is a real need for everybody who works in that area to talk about the impact of both things that work, the thing about what housing programs can do for stability and what stability can do for children, and how children doing better is better for society, and to talk about the ways in which some of the things we do doesn't work, because people who do case management, people who work, have that ground level experience that decision makers don't have, that people don't know. I do think there's some ways in which people like to believe things that don't make them feel guilty, and so so there's misinformation and misperceptions, and I think it's all of our responsibility to do something about that. I think I sort of answered the question. I may not, perhaps all the way.
All right. The next one is, what are the key factors in helping clients overcome their own personal barriers to change, and how effective do you believe encouragement is?
Okay. I might actually start with the second one. I think encouragement works when the other parts of it are also in place. And really, I'll go back to that last part of the presentation. When people have thought about how they want things to be different and better, when people have some idea of what they need to do to get there, when they're getting, when the things they do well are recognized. I mean, I don't really like the word praise. It's more that, like, you said you're going to do 3 job applications and you went to 6, and you went to 6 places. I mean, that's really good. That's really good, because it's hard when you drop those off and nothing happens. So I think that that encouragement really works best when it's in the middle of a plan, when people are doing planful activities, and it's really specific, and then it's sometimes, and when possible, it's really specific, and then sometimes it's just encouraging in that, I know it's tough to work really hard and nothing happens. I know that's really tough, and so there's some empathy going on with that. I think without encouragement, there really isn't that connection. I think the clients need to know, and this comes out non-verbally, that you want their lives to be better, that you want them to succeed, however that is, whatever that means. And so I think that's really where the role of encouragement comes in.
All right, the next question says, what approach can I use to cause a group of people who have bonded to change together in a positive way? And then it kind of clarifies multiple families in one facility who have established relationships with each other.
Let me just ask back in terms of, are those positive relationships that people have?
Michelle, can you type in or? Yes, they have become a sort of support system to one another.
Yeah. So my experience in working with a small, essentially family shelter was that from time to time there would be this really good connection that would form. I would come in, I was doing parenting groups, and I just remember, somebody saying, sorry if I'm yawning, we stayed up till 1:30 in the morning playing cards and laughing. And I thought, that for a lot of people, it's similar to what happened to those of us who went off to college, and stayed in a dormitory, and you started to meet people, and you could stay up all night and talk. And this was a chance where people had that kind of experience. And then I really think that the role of the worker is, when that's doing that, is to just kind of help to shape that, to underline the encouragement when it comes. I think there's some very specific things that can be done in terms of helping people to find jobs and supports through the networks that other people have. One of the difficulties, and this goes back to that whole value of individualism in the country, is people feel like they ought to be able to do it on their own. And in many cases, when people are successful, they're successful because of their social network, because they know somebody who knows about this job or this house, or somebody who's got a good used car that they'll sell for $1,400, and it really runs well. And so so it's through those connections and networks. And I think that can be done really purposefully, especially if people are already bonding. And so people get along with each other, they like each other, and then just trying to reframe that in terms of how can we help each other succeed. And because somebody may know somebody that could help Belinda, even though it's not something that I need myself.
All right, the last question we have for now is, any suggestions to help homeless individuals and families cope with this issue? It's easy to give them food, job leads, etc., but housing is not a quick, easy fix, even with a job. Shelters in the area that this person are few and in most cases unsafe.
One of the things that's really difficult about the work we do is, and frustrating, is that situation. It's not only the families, I think it's hard on workers. When you've got somebody who's doing all the right things, finding a job, doing that, and it's still difficult to find housing, and because it would seem to be, right? It would seem to be that if people play by the rules or do things well, then the pieces that are missing, like housing, should be there. And in many cases, and in many cases they just aren't. I mean, what we need to have, we need more, community-based organizations that are involved with low-income housing. And by low-income housing, really what I mean is duplexes and triplexes here and there. I mean, not big places, because there's difficulty, as you guys know, there's difficulty when you get lots of people with similar kinds of issues together. I mean, so there certainly is work that needs to be done on the community and on the state level, but that's difficult. I think one of the things that we've been able to do, and again, this is with the with Bethel House, with this faith-based thing, is just getting relationships with landlords and being able to being able to vouch for people, and people who may not have the credit record, who may not have who may have other problems, and just to say, this person's working a program, they've done really well, I'll be in contact with them, you can be in contact with me if there are any issues, and then just trying to get landlords to take a chance on somebody. And that really happens through relationship.
All right, that's all the questions we have. So thank you very much, Dr. Winship, for all your time and for taking time to answer all those questions and share that information with us. It's a helpful topic and things that we come in contact with every day. We'll be back in June with Dr. Winship doing a presentation on motivational interviewing. So that information will be sent out pretty soon to everyone to register. And then if you could please make sure that you answer the quick survey questions as you're leaving so we can get that feedback from you. And then we'll get the hard copy of the PowerPoint and the link to the recording so you can view that again on YouTube or share with other people at your location. We can get that to you probably by early next week. So if you have any questions, let us know. Otherwise, thanks for everything, and thanks for all of your participation today.
Certainly, and very, very good comments and questions, and take care.